Hello everyone, welcome to GS Booster Short, your daily dose for GS preparations. Today I've got the opportunity of being live with you. So, in our today's lecture, we're going to understand the difference between plurilateralism and multilateralism and how they're going to affect the global governance. Global governance happens to be an important topic with respect to GS2, with India seeking a enhanced position for itself at the global high table and more role in global governance. It is important for us to understand as to the difference between both these approaches and as to why are these approaches in concern. So, first of all, we need to understand how multilateralism works and how it is being shaped by global developments and international relations is a key focus in designing a new approach towards global governance. So as we know that because of geopolitical tensions today, the world is polarized, and which is why the multilateral institutions of late have become more and more ineffective. The WTO hasn't been functioning properly for quite some time. During COVID crisis, even WHO's role was also questioned and the lack of its effectiveness was also questioned. So which is why we today see that there is an enhanced push towards plurilateralism and minilateralism. When we are talking about multilateralism, we refer to global organizations which come in and with consensus form laws and rules for global governance, such as United Nations, WTO, WHO. Whereas when we speak of plurilateralism and minilateralism, over here we are talking about groupings of certain like-minded nations over issue-based. Basically, these groupings are generally issue-based or interest-based, such as the OECD, which is a grouping of the first world nations or the developed nations. Then we have various regional associations such as the European Union, such as the Asian Tigers that we are also known as ASEAN. Now, in recent times, we have seen an enhanced push towards plurilateralism and minilateralism. So, basically, it is being now today seen that plurilateralism and minilateralism are now emerging as an alternative and preferred approach for transnational governance. And why is this so? This is so because these organizations are more flexible, swift, informal, and more effective groupings of like-minded nations. For example, during the time of COVID crisis, the Quad initiative, Quad, the US, India, Japan and Australia, they came together and broad-based their cooperation and brought in a COVID vaccination supply for about the less developed nations and took an initiative of taking about giving 1 billion doses of vaccines free of cost to the entire low developing nations. So in this very manner we see how swiftly actions are taken when there are plurilateral groupings and unilateral groupings. Moreover, these are informal groupings, there are not a lot of procedures going into it, unlike we see when there is a resolution which has to be moved in United Nations, and even when one country speaks, 2 or 3 times the other countries are given opportunities to respond to them. We've already seen every time the annual address to the UN Assembly by leaders of the world. So, however, what is the downside of plurilateralism? So, the downside is that it is less inclusive compared to multilateralism, and multilateralism on the other hand is more representative, structured and legally binding, offering a consensus based approach to global governance. Now, supposedly 2 or 3 nations feel, or a number of nations feel about one way with respect to governance of Indo-Pacific, and whereas other nations are not feeling that very way. So, naturally there are going to be frictions when both of the groupings set out different sets of governing rules for this very area. Therefore, we see that plurilateralism at some place lacks consensus building, and moreover it is not inclusive. Then one of the most important thing is that these plurilateral agreements many a times are not legally binding. For example, when we speak about Quad, now Quad is not a treaty organization. So whatever obligations that we feel and whatever areas that these countries feel that they are going to cooperate in it, if one country today backs out, would that country be liable in any legal respect? Or would there be implications on that very country? No. Which is why, if solid initiatives are to be taken, therefore we have to see in those very areas multilateral organizations are most effective, because they legally bind the nations to a set of rules. Now, with respect to this very topic, now as I've told you that I have taken up this discussion, this topic from a very important ORF, Observer Research Foundation's debate, in which even the ambassador and the foreign secretary of our country participated. So, 4 points emerge with respect to this very topic. The answer would be intermingled. We won't be having distinct answer for them. However, and the answer to these 4 points would be overlapping. So what are these 4 points? Number 1, whether plurilateralism and minilateralism have now become the new norm of global governance, irrespective in place of multilateralism. That we have to see. That can plurilateralism and minilateralism completely basically take over the role of multilateral institutions. Secondly, is plurilateralism likely to fragment global cooperation, or is it likely to strengthen global cooperation by becoming an intermediate step to multilateralism? So this point states, the first point was asking us that whether plurilateralism can completely replace multilateralism, or plurilateralism can be seen as an intermediate step towards multilateralism. Because we have seen that consensus building at multilateral organizations is a very tough task, whereas what happens in plurilateralism is that 3 or 4 countries can take an initiative and start on with an objective, and then it can be an open accommodative step in which other countries can later on join. Or is plurilateralism going to fragment global cooperation in which certain countries will take one stand and they'll go by it irrespective of the fact whether other countries would come on board or not? Can in this very manner global initiatives and global governance work? Thirdly, does plurilateralism lend itself more naturally to certain issues like political and security against economic? So, this point states, it means that when we are speaking of plurilateralism, is there any difference to which to the issues to which plurilateralism suits? We see that countries are more likely to get into a plurilateral arrangement when it comes to political and security arrangement rather than economic engagement. For example, there can be a large grouping of allies such as the US and the European allies on security basis. However, these allies also hesitate when they are getting into economic cooperation. Take for example the issue of Hawaii. So, US was hell-bound to get Hawaii banned from the entire developing world or from its basically ally nations. However, every nation took their own time with respect to coming on a decision with Hawaii. Whereas, when we speak of coming and joining into a security apparatus, we don't see that much of reluctance of late. Lastly, what impact does plurilateralism will have on existing institutions like WTO and IMF that were set up with the intention of more broad-based consensus to global governance? This is somewhat similar to the second point. So, क्या plurilateral institutions का we are seeing like the Bretton Woods institutions, the WTO, IMF, they were established. In response to that, now we have the Asian Development Bank. Various regions are trying to set up their alternative financial institutions. There are groupings of certain regional areas which are working very fine, such as the EU and ASEAN groupings, vis-a-vis when we compare them to the United Nations. So, will these groupings basically weaken these multilateral institutions at the later step or not? That is also has to be seen. Now, if we are to answer this very paradigm with respect to plurilateralism versus multilateralism, I have jotted down out of this very discussion about 9 points for you, and from these very points this very concept would become more clearer to us, and we can use these points as it is if a question comes with respect to multilateralism, plurilateralism, or even with respect to how to do or way forward for global governance. Now, first of all, we have to see that the reason for this plurilateralism is the enhanced geopolitical tensions and a polarized world, which is nudging nations towards taking plurilateral approaches. Now, when it is asked that whether a country or what would be the reason for a country to take a plurilateral approach or a multilateral approach, now what could be the answer to this very thing? The thing is, Harsh Shangri-La, our present Foreign Secretary, so Ambassador Shangri-La says that countries when want to engage on a particular issue, their interlocutors, जो उनके basically negotiators होते हैं, they would try to find the most effective and appropriate format. Now, irrespective of the fact कि वो कौन सा format है, there would not be a certain bias towards any particular format. The thing that is more important is getting the work done, and therefore when any issue comes up with a country, that very country would try to resolve that issue and try to engage with other countries in the manner that best suits that very issue, and that would get the desired outcome. So it doesn't really matter whether countries would go for trilaterals, multilaterals, bilaterals, plurilaterals, or go for distinctly multilateral institutions. Then, if we are to see the trajectory as to what has led towards this nudge towards plurilateralism, basically we also have to recognize that multilateralism was also having its cracks. 25 years ago, when the bipolar world became unipolar, it was felt that there is a new age of global consensus-based cooperation and governance that is coming up. However, from 2000 onwards only, we can see the cracks in multilateralism. For example, the fall of the Doha round of talks. Then we have the Security Council resolutions getting blocked time and again. Then we saw the WTO getting blocked, in which US did not let the appointment to the appellate body, decision body of WTO, which is why the appellate body of WTO isn't functional. Then lastly, if we are to see that all these gaps in multilateral system, while they were existing and they were there, it was the COVID crisis which actually magnified these very gaps, in which we were able to see how nations resorted to nationalism, and basically we have also seen vaccine nationalism was also a concern at that very during COVID crisis. So in this very time, we see how multilateral institutions were not able to help, for example the WHO, in maintaining and curtailing this very huge crisis that the entire world came against. And over here we get a complete assurance for the fact that, or we can now completely clearly say that multilateralism is not as effective and there are certain gaps in it. However, if we are to see, we cannot completely discard it. Why? Because there are certain issues which need participation of all, like climate and health. Without participation of all, these issues cannot be actually resolved. Therefore, in recent time, plurilateralism is seen as an intermediate step towards multilateralism. Yes, plurilateralism does come out as an intermediate step towards multilateralism. Why do I see this? Now there are basically two models to this. One is the hybrid model. So hybrid model में मैं आपको एग्जाम्पल देता हूं आर्कटिक काउंसिल का. नाउ आर्कटिक काउंसिल में क्या है? बेसिकली आर्कटिक काउंसिल के अंदर वह सारी कंट्रीज हैं जो कि आर्कटिक ओशन के सराउंडिंग है, जिनका वहां पे EEZ का क्लेम पड़ता है. सो आर्कटिक काउंसिल के अंदर naturally it comes out as a plurilateral organization in which they are going to actually govern the Arctic waters when they are going to melt down. However, this Arctic Council basically works on UNCLOS, which is a law given by this global governance, a multilateral institution. So they are also respecting and actually working on the basis of multilateral laws. So then in this very manner, plurilateral organizations and groupings can exist on the basis of multilateralism. Second is that keeping their doors open for participation. How? Now, there are many issues why plurilateralism actually gets traction. The chief reason of it, one of is the free rider effect in multilateralism. What happens is, take for example WTO. Now just to bring on board every country, many countries such as the developing countries are given relaxations, whereas some countries basically take the cut. And over a period of time it is felt by these countries that just to have these countries on board with them and just being in an expectation that these countries are going to join in full scale at a later scale, these countries, the other countries who have actually made curtailments and given up certain rights, are actually losing on. For example, the case of most favored nation, the status of most favored nation that is given at WTO. And therefore, in plurilateralism this does not happen. In plurilateralism, the benefits of any organization will only accrue to those people who participate in it completely. Whereas in multilateralism, this is not the case. Everyone gets the benefits while few gets to bear the costs. However, now there are many issues on world which will require certain countries to come forward. The better way to go through it would be that few countries who want to take initiatives may come forward. They may get into an arrangement. However, they may keep those arrangements open-ended and should not block entries of other organizations, countries into those organizations at a later stage. So in this very manner, we have the hybrid approach and this open approach in which plurilateralism could serve as an intermediate and is actually serving as an intermediate step towards multilateralism. Now, especially in the age of science and tech, there is a need of new global governance framework, such as in the areas of cyberspace, such as in this area of space. So naturally, with new technologies coming every day, there is enhanced need for global cooperation, how internet is to be managed, who is to govern internet. Now, with respect to India, if we are to see our formal position, India believes in reformed multilateralism. Now, the reason for this is, what is reformed multilateralism? India says, and that is true for many other countries, that these Bretton Woods institutions or the global institutions which were set up for building a global consensus, they are basically a construct post World War II, such as the United Nations. And naturally, it would be a fallacy to think of that even after 75 years, these very institutions could actually serve the purpose and the objects of the world in the similar manner and in the similar structure that they could have or they thought of 75 years back. Therefore, India says that in order to maintain or make multilateralism more effective, the need of the hour is to reform these institutions such as the United Nations, such as the IMF, the quota system in IMF. So, by reforming them and giving valid representation to actual people and actual stakeholders who can actually make any difference, then only multilateralism would be effective, and therefore in that very respect multilateralism naturally is a good and preferred choice. However, it is when there is reformed multilateralism. Now with the question that another question which I posed earlier was whether plurilateralism lends itself easily to just political and security issues or with respect to economic issues also. In this very respect, we have to see the working of OECD countries. Now, OECD countries have been instrumental in actually getting the framework of global minimum tax, which would be, after it is executed, a multilateral system and multilateral solution to one problem. And the contributing factor and major partner for this was OECD. Besides this, OECD initiatives have also led to countries coming into a framework for better transparency with respect to tax administration, with respect to checking tax evasion. So yes, we cannot distinctly say that plurilateralism only lends itself to political and security issues. It can, and it is actually lending itself equally to economic aspects also. Lastly, plurilateralism and multilateralism are both tools of consensus building and no dogma should be attached to them. So no one should actually basically say, if we are to, why, when we pose this question, plurilateralism or multilateralism, we are basically trying to attach a dogma that if one is better or the other is better. These are basically just tools of consensus building, and therefore they should be seen as these tools only. And with whichsoever tool we can actually build upon a consensus and do better for with respect to global governance, that those tools should be adopted. However, it has to be seen that the downside of both the systems, that is the multilateral system and plurilateral system, with respect to plurilateral system is that it has to be inclusive. Lastly, with respect to multilateral system, it has to be representative. So these things are to be seen and these things should be worked upon. Lastly, one should not be theological about multilateralism. किसी को कोई भावनाएं नहीं अटैच कर लेनी चाहिए multilateralism से. It is just a construct for consensus building. So yes, this is all with respect to plurilateralism and multilateralism. Let us see if we have any comments. Yes, good morning to Ms. Rahman and Shailesh Agarwal. So that would be all from my side for today. Should you have any doubts, feel free to put your doubts in the comment section. I'd be more than happy to reply to them. So, thank you and have a nice day.